O Henry Marsh estudou Política, Filosofia e Economia na Universidade de Oxford antes de ingressar em Medicina. Tornou-se cirurgião em 1984 e em 1987 neurocirurgião no St. George's Hospital em Londres. Foram-lhe dedicados 2 documentários, Your Life in Their Hands, que foi recebeu uma medalha de ouro da Royal Television Society, e o The English Surgeon, este último sobre o seu trabalho na Ucrânia, galardoado com um Emmy. Depois de ter deixado a chefia da unidade de neurocirurgia em Londres, continuou a operar e a ensinar, nomeadamente no Nepal e na Ucrânia. Não Faças Mal é a primeira autobiografia em que, com coragem, honestidade e introspeção, fala sobre os erros, a culpa e o lado humano da medicina. Seguiu-se e acaba mesmo de ser lançado em Portugal, o Hoje Deu Entrada no Hospital, que é também um livro fabuloso. Henry Marsh, I don't know if you know, but you're in the right country and in front of the right audience.
Oh, good.
Because there's a saying in Portugal that says that every Portuguese has a little bit of a madman and the other bit of a doctor. So this is an audience. Exactly. The English talk about the weather, the Portuguese talk about their health and their illnesses. So any Portuguese will know everything about
the
English
don't like to talk about health.
No, they talk about the weather.
They're very embarrassed and shy about our
But no, Portuguese love it.
Isabel. Devo dizer, senão a tradução nem sequer a tradução vai funcionar.
I can use that, is that all right? No, I'm happy.
Já está ligado?
It's okay.
I was saying that beside being an amazing neurosurgeon and a compassionate and caring one at that, even if apparently short-tempered, and I'm taking your word on it because I haven't met you before today, you are a great writer. Your books have suspense. We never know where the story is going to lead us. The landscape descriptions mingled with your emotions are breathtaking, and your stories make us laugh and cry and leave us more aware than ever of how frail life is, but also of the importance of accepting that medicine has limits, and we would be wise to know when to give up and die in peace amongst the ones that most love us. Life and death, the theme that brings us here tonight. It is in every page of your books, but I still have so many questions to ask. Can I start?
Yes, please do.
Henry's wife said that normally he answers before the question ends.
I'm on strict. Yes, I'm sorry.
She's there watching you. But with me you can do that because I'll interrupt you also, so we're the same. You say that when you tell a patient after operating on him that you enjoyed the operation, normally they look at you with a little bit frightened.
No, horror, shock. Disgust.
And then you have to explain that they have to beware of a neurosurgeon who is not passionate about what he does. But how do you balance compassion and attachment? I mean, you need attachment to open somebody's head.
Well, this is the big central problem that all doctors face. I was doing a talk a few days ago in London with an English cardiac surgeon called Stephen Westerby, who has just published a book, a little bit like my book, about his work as a cardiac surgeon, though the book is sort of knee-deep in blood and different from mine. And he was saying, and it's a common saying among English surgeons, but you have to be a psychopath to be a surgeon. And I said, I don't agree with this. Technically, I think psychopathy is a quite different thing from what we have to. We have this very difficult relationship with patients. On the one hand, we want to help them. At the same time, we have to often lie to them or pretend we are more confident and certain than we really feel. We have to give them hope when maybe there isn't very much hope. Some patients are very difficult to deal with. So it's not a simple altruistic relationship at all. It's a very, very complicated relationship.
But you were one of the first neurosurgeons to operate on a patient awake.
Well,
Isn't that freaky? I mean, normally yes. A surgeon doesn't want to think there's a person there if it talks.
Well, that's true. I mean, I was the first person in Europe to do it for a particular sort of brain tumor surgery, operating under local anesthetic on the brain. I did not invent it. The brain does not feel pain. The only part of the head that feels pain is the skin. So if you anesthetize the skin, just as a dentist anesthetizes your tooth, you can then operate on the brain without it hurting. And I did that for various technical reasons. It was controversial when I started doing it almost 30 years ago, but now it is universal standard practice. But it is very interesting because, and I like to illustrate this, when I operate, I have it's with a microscope, and there's a television camera on the microscope, and then there's a TV monitor for the nurses and my trainees, so they can see what I'm doing. Like that, I'm looking at the microscope, my hands are down there. But it means the patient, in principle, can see as well, and I'll ask the patient, would you like to see your own brain? And most of them say no, but a few say yes. And then if they say yes, I then say to them, you are now one of the few people in the history
who have talked to
of the human race who have seen their own brain. And indeed, I was once operating on a tumor here, which is usually these particular tumors are more at the front, but the back of the brain is to do with vision. And this tumor was sitting, in technical terms, in the left occipital cortex. So, and then the patient was looking at the TV monitor, which was on the right side, and of course the left side of the brain sees things on the right side of the world. So the visual part of the brain was looking at itself, and you felt there should be the philosophical equivalent of acoustic feedback. There's an enormous explosion. There should be a metaphysical, philosophical explosion. Of course, there isn't.
There isn't.
But it's crazy, you know. And the thought. What are your thoughts made of? Well, everything you're thinking and feeling at the moment is electrochemistry. It doesn't feel like that. But this is the great sort of challenge of neuroscience.
But imagine that I put everything that's inside Henry Marsh's head, synapse, neurons, I don't know what all of that are called, in a petri dish. And would I have another Henry Marsh?
Well, the philosophers like asking all these endless...
I know, but you're a philosopher also.
Thought experiments, and I abandoned philosophy at Oxford University. I like to say, because I thought it was too difficult, and I'd take up something easier, like brain surgery, which is actually it's a lot easier, actually. No, there is a fundamental problem here, is coming to terms with the fact that our thoughts and feelings are physical. And then you have the whole question of free will. Do we really have the freedom to choose? And the question of crime and punishment. There's a wonderful book which has been published in England and America just a few months ago by an American neurobiologist called Robert Sapolsky, called Behave, and it's all about the neurobiology of human behavior. And his conclusion, and in a sense it's very difficult to disagree with, is we do not have free will. The way we behave, the way we think and feel is determined by our genes, by our environment, and by the structure of our brains. But he himself says it is impossible, really, to live your own life feeling you do not have free will.
Free will.
So there is this huge sort of philosophical anomaly at the heart of the modern world.
But what I found from your books, I'm sure that it's much easier to operate on a fatal situation than to tell a patient or his family that you can't operate.
Yes, I think on the whole that's true. It's very difficult to say go away and die. And this again is another huge growing problem in the modern world, which is the cost of healthcare and when do we stop? Most of us by my age will have had experience of at least one parent dying miserably from Alzheimer's disease. We all live too long. If you look at America, where I like to say, people say America, the land where death is optional. You know, if you spend enough money, you'll never die. So in America, beyond the age of 60, healthcare costs go up and up and up. And things are starting to go that way a bit in England as well. Now, when do you stop treating cancer?
You
80,
say that
90, 100?
when you began, 670 was the limit.
It was very different. It was very
was
different.
the limit for brain surgery.
I think there was, well, in terms of brain surgery, if people were over 65 years old, you said they're too old for brain surgery.
Until you reach 65.
Yes.
And then
Well,
when you
but it's
reach
changing. I mean,
65, you say 85.
Yeah, exactly. when do we stop? And it's more of a problem, not so much with brain surgery as cancer treatment, because cancer treatment, there's lots of new chemotherapy treatments. You may have seen last week the FDA in America just approved a new treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, where you take the white blood cells out of the patient, you then genetically modify the white blood cells so they will attack the cancer cells. It works very well, but it costs $400,000 per patient, you know. So
But when we're talking about where resources are not illimited, and you have to make choices, and if you're operating on people that are going to live only anyway more 4 or 5 years, and you're not using those resources for younger people that still have a long life ahead of them, and do you think in a national service, in a health service paid by the state, there should be a limit?
yes, I think there should be, but it's very politically, it's very difficult. I mean, in fact,
voters with the pyramid inverted and more older people voting.
if you wanted to make the world a better place, you would stop treating cancer in old people, and you would spend all the money on better education and better parenting to stop the large number of children who have such deprived backgrounds. There is very good, strong scientific evidence now based on the Romanian orphanages. You may remember there was that dreadful man Ceausescu who wanted lots and lots of young Romanians. So he banned birth control and abortion in Romania.
And he exported them
and as a result, because Romania was a poor country, the orphanages filled up with all these normal children who the parents simply couldn't afford to bring them up. And these children have been subjected to detailed neuroscientific studies because they were in the terrible conditions in the orphanages. They have smaller brains, smaller heads, and even more importantly, the amygdala, the part of the brain and the temporal lobes, which is to do with fear and anger and overwhelming emotion, are bigger. You know, their brain, the development of their brain has been grossly distorted by this very extremely bad upbringing.
But you say that in your book you write that when you grew more experienced and went on getting more experience in your work, you were more able to say no to operating.
I think so. I mean, this in the new book. I tell one story of a young man with a severe head injury, where basically if we operated, he would live but be left very disabled, paralyzed, down one side, probably with very limited speech. And if we didn't operate, he would die. And I had a long conversation with his brother, who was his only relative. And I said to him, look, you know your brother better than anybody else. Would he want to live in a disabled state?
But that's the difference.
And he said no. But a lot of doctors don't, they avoid
that's what I was
conversations
going
like
to,
this.
because
The problem is so many surgeons, particularly young surgeons, will say, oh, we must operate. Well, if we don't operate, he will die. Should we operate? And then in effect you're asking the family, do you love this person enough
exactly.
to look after them?
So it's the wrong
if they're
question.
disabled? And everybody says, yes, you must operate. But you need a longer conversation. And it's actually very frightening to sit down with the family and more or less try to persuade them to let somebody they love die. You're really frightened you might be wrong. You know, and most surgeons back away from that and will end up treating everybody. So maybe you have 99 vegetables and one good result. Is it worth it? You know?
But when you talk about it and you say that in the end people will asking you, well, but if you're deciding, you're thinking you're God, you're deciding somebody's life, yes or no. But you say that if a doctor can't cure, at least he can't put on more suffering on the person. So do you think you can do that choice? I mean, you have somebody in your operating theatre and something's gone wrong, and you look at that person and think it's she or he are going to become terribly disabled, they won't think, they'll be vegetative.
Well, it's a problem.
Can you choose?
I did, and I no longer work full-time, but sometimes I did. I hated it. I did not like doing it. But I've seen so many people with terrible brain damage. We deal in probabilities in medicine. It's not that if I look at an individual patient, I don't know what will happen to that person. But I will say, if I saw 100 people like that, 95 would be left terribly disabled, maybe 5 wouldn't be. But you're never certain, even the probabilities you don't know. And it is easier psychologically, it's easier to treat everybody and then close your eyes. The other way I illustrate the story is that often when I was still responsible for emergency work, I'd often be telephoned at night by the junior doctors, because the actual emergency operating in brain surgery is quite easy. You're just taking out a blood clot from the inside of a skull. It's technically, you don't need a very senior surgeon to do it. But the decision whether to operate or not is more difficult. And I felt a bit like Nero at the Roman Games, that my juniors would ring me up, I'd see the brain scan, they'd send it to me over the internet. And if I said operate, thumbs up, I'd go back to sleep. And if sometimes I said no, let them die, I couldn't get back to sleep because I'd be worried I was wrong. And yet if you run away from making these decisions, you will produce a great amount of human suffering. In everything, there are always winners and losers.
And losers.
And we all live longer. None of us want to die. But if we reach the age of 80, we have about a 45% risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. So, you know, it's nothing is straightforward.
We'll all die in the end. It's the end of the story.
Sometimes it's a very tedious business.
You say that too much hope can make you silly. And we understand that as humans and as patients, but you say that when a doctor is detached from reality and is too hopeful, he can operate and operate again. In a case where you tell us the story of a little boy who you refused to operate, and then he was operated on 3 times and then ended up by dying, and you were sued for it.
Well, the mother wanted to sue me, but she
felt like
she couldn't. But she hated me because I told her, it is time, in my opinion, it's time for your daughter to die.
But there's another doctor that...
And again, it's a paradox. Yeah, another surgeon was willing to operate. But it's a paradox that love can be very selfish. And it is incredible to what extent parents will sort of torture their children to keep them alive. But it's so difficult because you see leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children, until the 1960s, was a universally fatal illness. Once you diagnosed it, you knew that child would die. And then there were one or two doctors in America, there's a guy called Dana and Faber, and they started using poisons to treat these children. And the children all still died anyway. And then eventually in Philadelphia, at a hospital called St. Jude's, they worked out if you used 4 different poisonous chemotherapy drugs, you could actually cure some of the children. But at the time, many pediatricians said this was monstrous. These children were dying anyway, you were just torturing them to death with horrible treatment. So it's again a paradox. How much...
And how does science evolve
you have to
if you
experiment,
don't...
and the patients will suffer. You have to be hard-hearted. These are very difficult questions.
These books, you talk about the mistakes you made, or some of them are not made by you, but you feel responsible for them because somebody else under your watch made them. Would you have published this book if you were a practicing doctor?
I published the first book deliberately before I retired. In fact, I wasn't planning on retiring.
You had a tantrum.
I tell the story in the second book, but I had a temper tantrum with the management, and that's why I retired. So I could not have written that first book while I was still a young consultant, because it would have been professional. It might have been professional suicide. But again, there's a paradox here. As patients, we have to trust our doctors.
But that's
and how can you trust somebody if they're not honest? So in a paradoxical sort of way, a doctor who admits to making mistakes is more trustworthy than one who doesn't.
I know, but you also say that patients want to fill their doctor with superpowers. So if somebody admits, even though very honestly, they'll say, oh, that man is fantastic, but I'd better be operated by one who's never made mistakes.
Well, in that case, that's the patient's choice. They have that right to do it. But again, it is difficult because, again, as a doctor, you must inspire some confidence. Although I've told this story before about my wife. She was in hospital a while ago having her blood taken by a young doctor, and he made a mess of it. Now, all of us as medical, and any doctors in the audience will remember their first attempts to take blood, and you leave a long line of bruises and pinpricks all up the poor patient's arm. And at some point you have to make a decision: when do I ask for a more senior colleague to come and help me? But if I don't practice, if I don't do a difficult case, how will I ever get any better? And it's a problem we face as a surgeon.
So you say that they
so my wife Kate was having her blood taken badly by a young doctor. And what did the idiot then say to her? He said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I haven't really done this before." Which was the truth. Honest. What he should have said was, "You've got terrible veins. It's all your fault," So again, paradoxically, if you blame the patient will be happier.
That's a strange thing. And how did other doctors react to your book? I laughed.
My immediate colleagues, being English, I think, was slightly embarrassed and didn't.
And the Americans,
about it.
And you
it was
said,
very popular, and the book's been very, very
but
successful.
You said that when you were talking with the American neurosurgeons, then they didn't ask you any questions.
Well, that was a lecture I gave before I'd published.
I laughed because you say that they must have thought you completely incompetent.
Completely incompetent, or recklessly honest, or both. But in fact, the book has been immensely successful in America, particularly with neurosurgeons, and they all say you're saying you're the first person to say what it's really like, and they like it.
Yeah, but won't they say, they'll say, well, I have lots of colleagues that do mistakes like you, not themselves.
I think the answer is we all. I start the first book with a quotation from the French surgeon René Leriche, who said all surgeons have within themselves an inner cemetery, and it's a place where we have to go from time to time to think about our mistakes. The nature of surgery is dangerous, all medicine, particularly surgery, and it is human to make mistakes. It is normal for things to go wrong. So all of us, the phrase in English is we have skeletons in our cupboard. And the problem is, of course, if everything in life, we learn most from mistakes. Again, in a paradoxical sort of way, success is bad for us. Success makes us complacent and less critical. But the problem with surgery, particularly brain surgery, is that if operations go badly, the result for your patient and the family are so terrible that you can't face it, either to yourself, and then you will not learn from it. So the conclusion to my sort of medical lectures that I like to give nowadays is this fundamental fact, as you said, that other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am. So for me, a good surgical department is not one where there's one sort of brilliant individual.
So you say it's teamwork?
It's where the colleagues work together, where they'll criticize each other in a positive way, not being too friendly.
But you also say that people that work for you, interns, will always be terribly flattering.
Well, they tend to be.
Because they want to operate.
I try to discourage that. That's certainly a problem with patients. I mean, another difficulty with medicine is learning how to talk to patients, because fine, if an operation goes well, you can be extremely rude to a patient. They still think you're wonderful. So you have to judge doctors by when things go badly. And when things go badly, it's very difficult to know how to talk, because the patient, if I tell somebody I can't operate or they're going to die, it's cancer, whatever, they do not telephone me next morning and say, oh, Mr. Marsh, you were terrible, or Mr. Marsh, you were very good. So you get no minimal feedback. And we all know we learn in life from feedback. We do something, we do it well, or we do it badly, we get a commentary on it, and then we can do better.
You say that respecting the silences in the conversation is the most difficult?
That's his problem of the English phrase is breaking bad news, when you have to tell a patient or a patient's family that death or whatever is going to be the outcome. And again, I've not heard tape recordings or videos of myself talking. I do not know. I very rarely, now because of the success of my books, at literary festivals in England, I quite often meet patients or families from many years earlier. So I do now get some feedback. But I think when I was younger, these conversations are very difficult. And the temptation I found is to talk too much. I mean, if you're going to say to a family, your son, your child, your husband is going to die, there's really very little else to say. But the temptation is to talk too much and start using medical language. When in fact, probably, I suspect, but I cannot prove it, that the important thing is to sit there quietly, saying very little. Yeah. But that's very difficult.
Very difficult.
And the temptation is also to run out of the room and leave the family to cry on the nurse's shoulder. And then in England they'll be made a cup of tea.
You say that it's not the skills, the doctor's skills that are difficult, that the decision making in a theatre room.
The operate, it sounds a bit silly, but it's true. The actual operating is not very difficult. I mean, there are other branches of surgery, such as eye surgery or some microscopic vascular surgery, which is more delicate and more calls for greater manual dexterity. than brain surgery does. But the problem with brain surgery, all surgery, but particularly brain surgery, is the decision making. Because in effect you're saying, what is the probability of the operation going badly? What is the probability of the patient coming to harm if I don't operate? And a big problem in modern medicine is overestimating the risk of not operating. And if you work in many different countries, as I do, and I'm a professor in America in Seattle, though I don't operate there, is a totally different culture. The Americans will operate on everything, when probably actually, if they're not, and the patients are very well, operation's a great success, but it's actually a mistake. Because if they hadn't done the operation, the patient would also be very well, but wouldn't have been subjected to the risk of the operation.
But when you say decision making, you also say that you're always thinking, should I do this, or am I being a coward?
Yes, well, it's again these paradox. If you do a dangerous operation, and this is where this cardiac heart surgeon, Steve Westerby, who prides himself on doing terribly dangerous, difficult operations, and of course maybe most of the patients die. And he says, that's because I'm a very good surgeon. I only do the most difficult cases. True to a point.
True to a point.
But if you do a difficult operation, are you being brave or are you being stupid? And if you don't operate, are you being a coward or are you being very wise? And it's often very difficult to know where the balance lies.
But tumors are the dark force you fight against, but there are lots of diseases of the mind that won't come up in a scan. Do you think that in Western world, at least, where patients and doctors, are we good with mental health?
Well, I don't know about Portugal, but certainly in England, there is a lot of evidence that mental health services are in a very poor condition. In my second book, I talk about my own fairly modest psychiatric history. I wasn't severely suicidally depressed, but I was very, very unhappy and slightly suicidal, and spent a week as an inpatient in a psychiatric hospital, and had a year of psychotherapy afterwards, which I found wonderfully helpful.
I was going to ask you that.
I think all of us would benefit from psychotherapy,
Yeah,
and we shouldn't be ashamed of having. Life is difficult. Life is hard for most of us, and all the stigma needs to be reduced.
You read your books, and I had a question for you if you believed in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, because you are very insightful into your own childhood and into your own problems, into your own impulsivity.
If you mean by psychoanalysis, do I believe in Freudian
theory? No.
I think it's rubbish. But that doesn't mean to say psychoanalysis doesn't work. If you spend several £100 a week lying on a couch talking about yourself,
at least you're rested.
To a sympathetic person, it probably is going to make you feel a lot better. And there's good evidence for some things like panic disorders, anxiety attacks. The cognitive behavior therapy works. So there is some evidence. With depression, I'm not a psychiatrist, but with depression, which is said to be a huge increasing problem in the modern world, the evidence that antidepressants work is actually not very strong. It's generally said 1/3 of people, it's said waiting 2 years, having talk therapy or taking antidepressants all work roughly.
Yes, they even say that one day they will be able to look at a scan or a brain and decide if your depression will have a better outcome with psychotherapy or with deep brain stimulation or
you can never predict the future, but I think it personally is unlikely, given how complicated the brain is and really how little we understand about it. But we do understand a lot about the sort of social. We know that bad adverse experiences in childhood loneliness, social breakdown in modern urban life. All these have a bad psychiatric
You
effect.
even say that your father used to say that if your mother hadn't...
Well, that's a bit of a joke. Yes, it's quite a curious mind matter story. I was the youngest of four. My mother was a political refugee from Nazi Germany. My uncle was a Luftwaffe fighter pilot. My aunt was a fanatical Nazi, and in fact was killed by the English in an air raid in the town of Jena at the end of the war. But my mother had what in retrospect was probably a sort of nervous breakdown when I was born, though it took the form of very strange bruising over all her arms and legs, which was quite paralyzing. I still don't quite know what the diagnosis was, but eventually, anyway, everything else having failed, she was admitted, I think for so many weeks or months of inpatient psychoanalysis by a German emigre doctor who obviously
But who had empathy with her suffering, perhaps.
And then she was fine, and then got better, but maybe it was just enforced rest and escaping.
Yes, with 4 children, we believe that...
But then 30 years later, the problem recurred, and was panic in the family household. But there was some new drug called Dapsone, which was prescribed, it cured her immediately. No prolonged, one tablet, one pill, instead of months of psychoanalysis.
But in the end, you come to the conclusion that maybe you would have been a different child.
Well, I think I was a difficult child because I've always been very emotional. I'm not a manic depressive, but it's called cyclothymic, I suppose. I go up and down like a yo-yo, and my parents would find me pretty difficult at times. So when I was older, sometimes they'd tease me and say that I'd suffered from maternal deprivation.
We talk normally of death as an accident, nearly. It's something that we think, if this hadn't happened, she would be alive, if this hadn't happened. But then your experience in Nepal surprised me, because I thought maybe they'd have a different approach.
Yes, I thought so as well. I've been working in Nepal for almost 2 years off and on now. I'll be back there in November. And I thought, being a very intensely religious society, very uneducated, Buddhist, Hindu, all muddled up together. But they really cannot cope with death at all. And they would want, seemingly, to the extent I could understand what was going on, they found it very, very difficult to accept that a member of their family
you'd have to call the police.
That was more the fact we don't have any kind of medical litigation, so that if a patient died, they would often threaten to kill the doctor or blackmail the doctor. Or when I was 2 weeks before I was there on my last visit, a family smashed all the hospital's windows as a sort of protest. It's quite difficult out there. But in Pakistan, where I was in Karachi, I was told about 500 doctors have been killed in the last few years. My colleagues there say, no, Henry, it's very difficult to operate when the family are outside the operating theatre with Kalashnikovs saying they'll kill you if the operation, true story, if the operation isn't a success, European doctors may think they have a difficult time, but our colleagues elsewhere have a much more difficult time.
I enjoyed your example of one of your mistakes when you operated on the right side of the spine.
On the wrong side, yes.
On the wrong side of the spine. And you talked to the patient, and the patient said, oh, don't worry, I also install kitchens, and I've installed kitchens on the wrong way around. And you say that when you have to make a mistake,
choose your patient.
Yes. If you have a very sympathetic patient like that.
Well, no serious.
So in Nepal and Pakistan, you wouldn't find a patient saying that they installed the kitchen.
No. Very, very.
But do you think
very, very tense relationship.
Do you think they were contaged by our idea that medicine has no limits? I mean, we thought it was a Western problem, but have we, because you say also they consume a lot of medicines.
Oh yes, no, it's chaos. It's like the way the tobacco companies are unloading cigarettes on the poorer countries. The drug companies unload vast numbers of drugs, which are taken in a very random and chaotic way.
So you think maybe that what's their future? They'll have.
I mean, the biggest medical threat, I would have thought, is antibiotic resistance. And although I think there is some more research, basically no new antibiotic has been discovered for about 20 years. And as you know, in China and America, they feed antibiotics by the ton to livestock, to pigs and cows, to make them grow quicker. And resistance is building up. I mean, it's possible in 10 or 20 years' time, we could be back in the pre-war situation. And modern medicine depends on all chemotherapy and most surgery depends on antibiotics.
But do you think that in Western world, with people facing death can decide more if they want, I mean, not to be resurrected, lots of things? Do you think
yes, well,
will accept?
I end my second book with a sort of passionate plea I prefer the phrase assisted dying. I mean, technically...
But I'm not saying only that, we'll go on to it in a second, but I was just saying that people are more able to decide for themselves that they don't want excessive treatment.
I think so. I think if you... not some people. I think if doctors speak properly and openly to patients so they can make a informed decision, my experience is with English patients, most people, not everybody, will be realistic.
Do you find...
I've trained American neurosurgeons in London for almost all my career, and my American trainees always say, English patients are so easy compared to American patients. American patients are all optimists and consumers. They have much higher, and they spend a lot more money. English patients, on the whole, partly because they're English, partly because it's a government system, they're very grateful for being treated, and they don't like complaining. So it's much, my American trainees say it's much easier dealing with the English than the Americans.
But when people decide that they don't want to go on having treatments, you find sometimes that doctors won't let it happen.
That certainly happens.
It's not the patient, it's the doctor that will say, no, now we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that.
And I mean, there are many, I cannot generalize. There are many reasons for that. It's partly a lot of it's because doctors avoid a painful conversation. We do not like telling patients there's nothing more useful to achieve. And it can also be because doctors like work, they like treating people, they may make money from it as well. But there can be many reasons, but often the problem is the doctors, I agree.
And you talk, before we go to the last question, but you decided that when you quit the hospital, that you'd have a second life, a new opportunity, and you're rebuilding your house and doing your own tables and everything. Do you have any advice for us who are at that stage?
Well, I think it's very. And the second book is a slightly melancholic meditation on getting older, and I've not stopped medicine completely yet, and I will find it very, very difficult to stop doing it.
But you have to stop?
I think the important... I will have to stop one day, yes. But I think it's mainly teaching I do now. That's what I really enjoy most of all, is teaching me.
And using your hands?
And using my hands. But I do that with making furniture and things like that. No, I think the important thing about growing older is keep physically fit. There's lots of evidence that physical exercise is good for the brain, as well as blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, everything else. It doesn't stop me dying.
I don't know if
it only postpones Alzheimer's. But I run almost every day, So I brought my running shoes to Lisbon, so I should go for a run tomorrow morning. It's very important. But also let's keep busy, be mentally active, to do lots of things.
At least even if you die the same, you will be entertained until then.
Well, yes, to a certain extent. But I mean, but as I say at the end of my second book, I have this, it's pathological, but I need to feel useful. I need to work. For me, medicine never really felt like work. For me, it was always love. It still is. I felt very privileged to have a job which basically every day was so incredibly interesting and exciting, and I wanted to try to...
And they paid you on top of that.
And I paid for it too. Yeah. And then I became a best-selling author on the basis of it too. I really shouldn't complain.
But you found a new way, because writing, you wouldn't have time so much. Would you have time if you were full-time neurosurgeon?
No, I did most of the writing while still working full-time. Mm-hmm. No, I did.
And you're right so far, sitting.
Yes.
But now we'll talk about euthanasia, and do you think your last chapter you defend the right to die, to choose to die?
Yes.
But my question is always, somebody will have to kill you, and that is a weight you put on somebody else.
Well, first of all, you can just give somebody a tablet. You don't have to give them a lethal injection like in an American prison or hit them on the head. I met a very nice Australian doctor when I was in Australia recently who has been campaigning for assisted dying, which is now actually becoming legal in Australia, partly because of his campaigning. But basically he was given, friends of his who were vets, animal doctors, gave him a drug called Nembutal, which is a powerful barbiturate. I think that's what they use in Dignitas in Zurich. It's just a tablet you take, you fall asleep. But the fact of the matter is that assisted dying, doctor-assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it, is legal. It's now legal in Canada. It's been legal in Oregon in America for many years, also now in Vermont and Maine. It's been legal in Holland, Belgium, and Switzerland, and Japan for many, many years. So there is plenty of evidence to see what happens. There's a small but very strong political lobby opposed to it in England, probably mainly Catholics, and the only argument they can really produce is, there'll be all these greedy relatives
trying to kill off.
Will be bullying Granny to kill herself so they can get the family jewels. Well, it's possible. It doesn't seem very likely to me.
But do you experience you have patients that are so, you tell them you can be operated on or you can die, and they all choose to be operated on. Do they really want to die?
Brain surgery is rather different. I'm talking about medicine.
I know, but I'm saying when you find a person near the limit of suffering and wanting.
Well, if people have brain tumors, and I don't think surgery is going to help, the patient won't be able to you won't be able to discuss it with the patient because their brain won't be working. It's a conversation you have with the family. So assisted suicide does not apply to my own...
No, but what I wanted to know is if you feel that people in very desperate situations and that could do nothing, not be operated on and die, and even so, they fight and they try...
But that's their choice. I mean,
I know, their choice. I'm only asking if you think that people, in fact, when they are in that position, do they feel like killing themselves, or will your experience is that people will fight? I mean, today you're sitting here and you can say, yes, I'd love to have an assistant. I think we'd all answer that. Would you prefer to die with a tablet or die with suffering? But in the end, when you reach that point, is your experience that people choose?
My medical experience doesn't tell me the answer to that. But what you need to do is look at countries like Holland and Belgium where it is available. And where, I mean, it's particularly relevant to diseases like motor neurone disease, which is a death sentence, where you will slowly become paralyzed and choke to death. And some people can look death in the face better than others. We'll vary. I mean, in my own practice, my own medical practice, I would find with some patients I could have a more or less completely open conversation about what faced them. With others, they really didn't want to hear and didn't want to know.
And do you respect that? If a patient doesn't?
Yes, you respect it. I mean, you still try to tell people the truth, but if they don't want to hear it, you don't ram it down their throat. That would be quite wrong. So the point about assisted dying is it's not licensing doctors to kill patients. It's giving us as individuals, which is unusual and unlikely, but if we develop a disease like motor neuron disease, where we know it is going to kill us, and there's no treatment at the moment at all, it gives us the right to choose how and when we die. It's not about licensing doctors to kill people at all. And there are many ways you can organize it. And as I said, there is plenty of evidence, because it is available now in several countries, but it works pretty well. And there's only a small number of people who want to take advantage of it. But as a doctor, I have no illusions, or I have fewer illusions about what a disease will mean. What I will decide when my time comes, if I don't drop dead suddenly with a heart attack or a stroke, I don't know. But if I did get something like motor neuron disease or a malignant brain tumor, I would I think, because I'm an informed
You couldn't
consumer.
decide because you had a malignant tumor.
Sorry?
Your family would have to decide for you.
Well, yeah, but occasionally in the early stages, I might be compos mentis. It seems to me the two markers of a civilized society are the bicycles and assisted dying.
Shall we ask people if they have questions for us? Papers, questions? My daughter is in the audience, and as I told you, her question is, can I stay with her children tomorrow? But it's in English. What is your opinion about the development of machine intelligence? Sorry, I don't have my glasses.
Well,
do you want to read it? It's
interfaces.
English.
Development of brain-machine interactions. Yeah, computer-brain interfaces. Well, there is some very interesting research going on into this. This is where you put electrodes onto or into the brain and link the brain to a computer. There are some practical problems, which is the electrodes, you get scar tissue forming around the electrodes. And with some of the patients who have had these electrodes implanted into the brain, they usually stop working after a year or so, I believe. So there's some fairly difficult technical problems. Also, sticking wires into the brain is potentially dangerous and damaging. So it's not research you can do very easily. But you can put electrodes into single brain cells. That's done routinely for some epilepsy surgery. So in theory, there is great potential. But in practice, how it will work out is very difficult to know.
Because nowadays they can put that, deep brain stimulation.
Yeah, deep brain stimulation is a way of temporarily switching off a little bit of the brain. So it's used mainly for movement disorders, Parkinson's disease, things like that, where in the past we actually destroyed part of the brain. It doesn't cure Parkinson's disease at all, but it can help. And again, some very interesting research published only a few months ago on mice with Parkinson's disease, that it seems that Parkinson's disease in some way is triggered by the bacteria in the intestine, which is extraordinary. Shows how complicated these things are.
And we're all together.
Yes.
Everything is
exactly.
related. Another person is asking you if imagination is important in your work and why.
Imagination. I think it's. I don't. In many ways, brain surgery is a declining specialty. I'm often asked, what is progress in brain surgery? And in the 35 years I've been a brain surgeon, the progress has been to make a lot of brain surgery unnecessary, with new ways of treating aneurysms, new ways of treating small tumors. So in terms of technical imagination, I've not been doing work like that. But in a broader sense, as I said, we all face this problem of finding a balance between compassion and detachment for our patients. And I don't like the word empathy. I think empathy, you must learn to suppress your empathy. If you use the English word empathy in its strict sense, it means actually feeling what somebody else feels. Doctors cannot do that. If I felt for my patients as if they were members of my family, I couldn't do the work. So you must suppress empathy, but you must use your imagination to think what that patient is feeling, what they need, what sort of person they are. And that calls for human imagination, to put yourself in the patient's position. So I like the word rational compassion, where you imagine, well, this is what it is like to be a patient. And believe you me, most doctors do not understand, and nurses also, because most healthcare is done by fairly young, healthy doctors and nurses who've never been patients and don't realize what a frightening, humiliating experience it is to be stuck in a bed with all these people standing up around you. So I'm always telling my trainee doctors in London, you think you're these sort of nice, cool dudes, brain surgeons, fantastic guys, patients love it. I said, your patients are frightened of you. That's the main, they depend on you, but they're frightened of you. It's a completely unequal, asymmetrical relationship.
And especially
you need imagination to overcome that.
It's not like a restaurant where you can say, well, I'm not liking the lunch and I'll move to the next one. And you feel completely dependent.
Exactly.
You can't run away.
I don't know about Portuguese patients, but in England, we're very reluctant to complain as patients. We don't want to upset the doctor, because my life is in his hands. I want the doctor to sort of like me.
Exactly, and so I can come back again and see the same doctor and the same nurse.
And many doctors don't quite realize, until they get older and become patients themselves, or members of their family become patients.
And then they see it from the other side.
And then they understand a little bit more,
There's another question. The question I don't really understand very well, but maybe you do. Does your work allow for intense flow states?
Intense?
Flow states.
Slow?
No.
Flow. Yes, when operating. I have no interest in gambling at all. But I was once in a casino watching people playing roulette. There was complete silence, and there was watching the ball going round and round and round with absolute concentration. And it was fairly clear that they were living intensely in the moment. And when you operate, it's like that. Operating is never boring. And although sometimes things are going badly and it's upsetting, there is a real sense of flow and living very intensely in the present moment. And operating is an addiction. I mean, I still operate a bit, but you go into surgery because you want to be a surgeon, but there is something very, very satisfying about it because it's so intense. And when you're doing that operation, nothing else matters. You're completely concentrating and you're not thinking about anything else. And that I suppose you could call is a sort of flow state. The opposite is doing an outpatient clinic, which is the most unflowing state imaginable. And although once I have the patient sitting in front of me, I always rather liked outpatients. I like talking to patients and trying to understand them. But in between patients, I'd really feel like, and sometimes I'd do an all-day outpatient. I'd start the outpatient clinic at 10 in the morning and not finish till 9 o'clock at night. And that is 100 times more tiring than operating. Operating is not tiring.
You can choose your own music.
Well, I used to listen to music when operating, but then for various reasons I stopped.
If the patient is not talking?
Well, once the patient wanted to have Barry Manilow during an awake craniotomy, and I drew the line at that. I said no.
There's a question that somebody is asking if antibiotics can cause dementia and Parkinson and things like that, and Alzheimer's.
Not that I know of. And all drugs have side effects. The commonest problem with antibiotics is Clostridium difficile, intestinal problems. And some antibiotics can cause deafness. But I'm not aware of antibiotics causing. Most of a lot of the commonly used antibiotics don't cross into the brain anyway. So I don't think they cause...
an antibiotic like the fluoquinolones. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do any of you know the name of this?
I don't know, sorry, I don't know what
don't.
that would be. Ciprofloxacillin. Well, that's the one that's, it's used for anthrax and things like that, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I use ciprofloxacillin when I'm in Nepal, when I invariably get diarrhea, but it hasn't done me any harm yet. But
there's another question that says, you said sometimes you have to decide between life and death of a patient and God. What is your relationship with God? Are you a believer?
I'm a total non-believer. I discuss this in my second book for two reasons. Firstly, as a doctor, you see terrible things happen to patients. And it's particularly upsetting to see bad things happening to children. And brain tumours after leukemia are the commonest cancer in children. My own son had a brain tumour when he was a baby. And I see many children, particularly now, working in Ukraine, where I work in a children's hospital with inoperable brain tumours. And it's very hard to believe in any kind of benign, kind deity when you see this happen to children, and the suffering of a child, the suffering of the parents. So surely the only way you could make that kind of suffering compatible with a kind God is if there's life after death. But then as a brain surgeon, I see people where the frontal lobes of the brain have been damaged, usually with head injuries. Sometimes I tell a story in the second book of a man who suffered a horrible personality change because of a tumor. In fact, there was a famous case, some of you may have heard of the Texas gunman in 1962, I think, Charles Whitman, who left a suicide note saying, "Something's gone wrong with my brain, is telling me to do terrible things. Please have my brain autopsied when I'm dead," and then killed his mother and his family, and then climbed up a tower in Texas, in the University of Texas, and killed 14 people and wounded 50.
Could have done a CAT scan before.
They did an autopsy of his brain, and there was a tumor pressing on the amygdala, this part of the brain which generates anger, fear, and aggression. So I see people whose fundamental moral nature has been changed by demonstrable physical changes in the brain. So it seems to me very unlikely if what seems to make us true human beings, which is our social moral behavior, if that can be destroyed or changed for the worse in a diabolical sort of way by a head injury, by a tumor, then it seems unlikely there's any life after death. I find it hard to believe in the idea of a human soul. So if there's no life after death, I don't see how you can justify this terrible suffering that you see with children with nasty illnesses. So that's my view.
Your view. So are there any more questions?
Well, you see, in your last interview at The Guardian in past July, I believe, you tell this difference between these feelings, the terrible feelings of a man with your profession, neurosurgeon past. We have here a man exceptional like you. Her name was João Antunes. I can tell it with free speech because I'm not Portuguese, it's not defending nothing of a particular country, but when you live in the edge, or you feel an universal understanding, I believe, of these conditions, of all these things we call life. You can tell me how people, especially neurosurgeons, change the kind of seeing things, to feel things, for a very special way, like I saw in your book. I just read one, but tell something else, because I have to remember this before all is a literary festival, not a medical festival. You go too much in this way. Excuse me, Mrs. Isabel, but it's very. Could you please
talk about your literature?
About literature? Well, I started writing when I was 13 years old. I've kept a diary for almost every day of my life since then. I wrote only for myself. I liked writing. I was so embarrassed by my teenage diary, I destroyed it when I was 21 years old. But then, which I regret now. It would be interesting to see how stupid I was when I was a teenager. But I kept on writing ever since. And then when I met my second wife, 18 years ago, and she is a very successful writer, an anthropologist, and she would ask me sort of, what did you do at work yesterday? And I'd pull out my laptop and read some of my diary to her, and she said, oh, well, that should be a book. So that was how the first book came into existence. I come from a very bookish family. My parents' house was lined with books. I was unusual for an English doctor, but I did a different degree, politics, philosophy, economics. So I was very lucky to have a double education. In England, almost all doctors go straight from high school to medical school. They will have never really learnt how to write. They just do multiple choice examinations, things like that. In America, it's a bit better, because in America, medicine is they all go to university and do any degree, college, and then go to medical school when they're older. And that, I think, is good. So, again, it's luck, my family, my education. But I always wanted to write, and I always had a deep urge to do it, to put things into words. And where that comes from, I don't know. But it definitely was a part of me from a very early age. A cynical view would be, it was because I was the youngest of a family of 4, and was always trying to draw attention to myself, and sort of shouting and trying to say, look at me, look at me, look at me. And of course, if you do write, you are saying, look at me. And writing is a form of self-promotion and self-advertisement. But there's a deeper love of language below that. I was very lucky that when I was at school, for my high school final exams, I think it's called A-level, like the baccalaureate in France or the Abitur in Germany, I did quite a lot of Shakespeare, King Lear and The Tempest, and that gave me a deep love of Shakespeare in English. So my wife and I often talk about how does one become a good writer. I think partly it's by reading a lot. I think maybe some people just can write without having read a lot, but I think reading a lot is very important.
So thank you very much.
Sure.
And maybe
I ask another thing. How are your bees?
Dead. It's a terrible disaster. That's heartbreaking. 8 years I've kept bees in my garden in London, and 2 weeks ago, and there was about 25 kilograms of honey in the hive, and then for some reason they died, and the wasps got in, took all the honey, as well as all the bees were dead. So
looks like terrorism.
Heartbroken. Terrorism. So I shall probably start a new colony next year. But
because there's some African wasps that are coming and eating the bees.
Yes, they haven't got to England yet. They've got to France.
To Portugal.
Yes.
Also.
They're terrible.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
It was so nice having you.